You're listening to the weekly Parsha podcast recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramah Shemesh Israel, 5776, 2015. This week's Parsha is Parshas Vayigash. We have the completion of the story with Yosef and his brothers. We have the reconciliation between them. And we have Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, being told the amazing news that his son, who for 22 years he thought was dead, was actually alive and was a leader over Egypt. Yaakov Avinu, Jacob, comes down to Egypt, meets his son, and in that process of Yaakov coming down, the Torah tells us, it gives us an enumeration, counting of all of the offspring of Yaakov Avinu, of Jacob, and as is the way of the Torah, as the Torah continues, the Torah enumerates and counts the Jewish people consistently, constantly, and it's always interesting to try to understand what is the idea behind the counting. What is the idea? Why does Hashem count the Jewish people? Give us the number. Why is the number so important? But what I'd like to focus on specifically here in this week's Parsha, in this counting, is the fact that we have something which is very difficult to understand. And the Midrash talks about it. The Torah tells us, it gives us a count, it enumerates the children of Yaakov Avinu, of Jacob, and tells us there were 66. There were 66 offspring of Yaakov Avinu, of Jacob. And then the Torah gives us Yosef, tells us that Joseph and his two sons, Menashe and Ephraim, were in Egypt. So the Torah doesn't say it, but it does come out to 69. And then the Torah says that this totals 70. So the Torah says something which seems to be incorrect or inaccurate. This is the verse, it's in chapter 46, verse 27. Uvnei Yosef asher yulad lo b'Mitzrayim nefesh shnayim. The children of Yosef that were born to him in Egypt were two. All of the offspring of Jacob who were coming down to Egypt, or including Yosef who was there in Egypt, are 70. So the Midrash struggles to try to understand who was number 70. Who was number 70? How did we get to 70? We got from 66 to 69, and then we got to 70 somehow. The number 70 is inaccurate. So the Midrash wants to understand where that number comes from. So now the Midrash gives us a few different explanations as to who was number 70. The first explanation is the most famous one. I believe Rashi brings it down. Here's the Midrash. It says inside, quotes the verses. Rabbi Levi b'shem Reb Shmuel bar Nachman. Rabbi Levi said in the name of Reb Shmuel bar Nachman, Ra'isa mi'amecha Adam, have you ever seen in your life a person who gives his friend 66 cups? Then he gives him another 3. And he counts them as 70. He says, I've given you 70 cups. It's very strange. He's asking this question, b'derech mashal, with an analogy, which we also need to understand. What's the choice of this analogy? Why did he choose cups? Why didn't he choose barrels? Why didn't he choose pieces of pizza? I don't know. Why did he choose cups? This is interesting. Maybe we'll try to understand that. But he says, have you ever seen such a thing? Who is number 70, which is not counted, which we don't see? Who's the 70th cup, so to speak? It's Yocheved. Sheshlima minin shel Yisrael b'Mitzrayim. She completed the number 70 of the Jewish people coming down to Egypt. So that's the first pshat. That's the first understanding. So the question becomes, if indeed Yocheved was there on the way down, why wasn't she counted? Why was she only counted in a hint way? Why wasn't she outrightly mentioned? So the Midrash explains this. Rabbi Levi b'shem Shmuel bar Nachman Amar. Rabbi Levi, in the name of Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachman, says, Yocheved ibura be'eretz Canaan, v'leidas be'eretz Mitzrayim. Yocheved was conceived in the land of Canaan, in the land of Israel, but she was born in Egypt. So the reason that she wasn't enumerated in those that were coming down to Egypt is because she was just conceived, and she was just a fetus on the way down. But she was indeed born as they came to Egypt. So the Torah says that there were 70, even though it doesn't explicitly state who the 70th person was. Now it's important to still ask, why indeed does the Torah not mention her? Why does the Torah leave her name out? She was born already at the time that they came there, that they got there. What is the lesson? Why is the Torah telling us this at this point, as the Jewish people come down to Egypt? What is the deeper idea that's being taught here. So the Midrash continues and tells us a few other possibilities as to who is this mystery 70th person who is not counted but is included in the count. There are those who say that the number 70, even though it's speaking about the Kol Yotzei Yerach Yaakov, all the offspring of Yaakov, but there are those who say that the 70th person who's being enumerated as the offspring of Yaakov was Yaakov himself, was Jacob himself. This also needs explanation. What is the idea here? What does it mean that Yaakov is included in his offspring? The next possible explanation of the Midrash is even harder to understand. There are those who say that God himself was the number 70, so to speak, as the Meforshim explained, because Hashem said that I'm going to come down with you, down into Egypt. So Hashem himself, as it were, is the 70th person, or the 70th aspect here. Also needs explanation. And in explanation of this idea, the Midrash tells us, Yitzchak says that to understand what does it mean that God himself is the 70th. So we have an analogy to two legions of the king, the Kamania v'Gaustiana. There are two different types of legions. One's a stronger legion, one's a weaker legion. One has more people, one has less people. That the legions, and I'm going to come back to this idea, we need to understand this analogy. I think it's very powerful and perhaps it gives us a depth of what is going on here. But for a moment, just hear the mashal, the analogy, hear the question, and then we're going to come back to this. When you have these legions, so what they would do is they would set up the legions that each legion would have a certain number. Let's say this legion would have 1,000 people, 1,000 soldiers. This legion would have 500 soldiers. However, what they would do is when they would count out the people, they would actually make the legion that was supposed to have 1,000, 999. They would make the legion that was supposed to have 500, only 499. And this way, when the king would come, the king himself would be the completion of the legion. So that the 999 plus the king, when the king would come to lead his army, the king would be the completion of each of the legions. So that he would bring the number to 1,000. He would bring the number to 500. They would specifically make the number missing one so that the king himself would be leading and be a part of each of the legions. Clearly, this needs explanation, but somehow this analogy will help us understand the idea here on a deeper level. We'll see soon. Now the Midrash gives us another explanation. Who was the missing 70th? There are those who say that who was the 70th? It was the son of Dan. Dan had one son, his name was Chushim. He was deaf, that's why he was called Chushim, because he was missing one of his senses. The word Chushim means senses. So he was the one who completed the 70th aspect here. He was the number 70. And in explanation, which also needs an explanation, but in explanation, the Eitz Yosef says that even though he was counted previously, we had his, if you look at the names over here, the name Chushim ben Dan already appeared. We already counted him. He was one of the 66. Nevertheless, he was so chashuv, he was so significant that he's counted twice. That's the explanation of the Eitz Yosef, which of course needs explanation, because what does that mean? He's so chashuv, he's counted twice. What does it mean? You also have Yehuda. Why wasn't Yehuda as chashuv? Why wasn't he counted twice? You have so many people. All of the children, the offspring of Yaakov, of Jacob, were so significant. Maybe Yosef should be counted twice. What's the idea? Why is Chushim ben Dan counted twice? What's the idea? What's the depth of this explanation of the Eitz Yosef? It's also very interesting how the Midrash continues in talking about Chushim ben Dan, and it gives us something which is also a quandary that also needs explanation, but also holds the key to what's going on with the teaching of this Midrash is. In the Torah of Rabbi Meir, they found that there was an extra line there. It said the son of Dan was Chushim. What's the idea? Meaning Rabbi Meir had scrawled into the Sefer Torah that who is this 70th person? It's Dan ben Chushim. It's Chushim ben Dan, I'm sorry. So somehow there's an explanation for this in that which it says in the verse. The verse in Shmuel Beis in 2 Samuel chapter 24 verse 6 refers to the place that Dan lived as an area of Chodshi, which means new. Also the word Chodshi can mean a month. And V'gomer, etc. And then the pasuk says, Beis Yerach Sinim. Keeps referring to the place that Dan lived as the place of the moon, the place of the new moon, of the month. What is the idea that Dan is referred to as the Yerach, as the new moon? It's very deep. It's very powerful. Midah keneged midah. It was corresponding in a measure, corresponding to a measure. Dan nichnas b'tzalma nisa etzel aviv. Dan, he came in the shadows to his father. Dan, he had one child. He looked around. All of the other tribes had multiple children. He was the only one with only one son. And who was his son? His son was in the dark. His son was in the shadows, so to speak. He wasn't able to hear. He was missing that capacity. So he came in there in the shadows. Misbarach b'shivim elef. And what was Yaakov Avinu? What did Yaakov say? Yaakov gave him a blessing. And that blessing, the way that it manifested was that the tribe of Dan was very great. Even though it started off with only one person, they had many people in the Shevet. They had the Midrash refers to it as 70,000, but the numbers are actually in the 60s. It's just rounded off. Ubinyamin nichnas basara. This in contrast to Benjamin. Benjamin had 10 children. And nevertheless, Misparach barbarim elef, when the Torah describes how many he had, it talks about it in terms of 40,000, which is really also a rounding off. It was in the 30s, sometimes it was in the 40s, but the point is that Binyamin started off with what seemed to be much more. Dan started off with what seemed to be much less. And nevertheless, Dan was blessed with a ribui, with an adding, because of the fact that he started off with less, because of the fact that there seemed to be a diminishment, which clearly has to do with the idea of the chodesh, of the new moon, of the moon being diminished, and then there being a rebirth, the cycle. But the blessing came because of the fact that there was diminishment in Dan, in his children, the number of his children, and even in the child himself. So that led to greater blessings. So because Dan is somebody who represents blessings in diminishment, when there's a number missing, that number is Dan. It's Chushim ben Dan, and he's the completion. So we're starting to get a picture here. I'm saying it almost in riddles, but we're trying to understand what is the idea here. What is this Midrash saying? What does it mean that Dan, because he's missing something, because he's less, therefore he's more, and there's blessings and there's greatness, and that's the number 70. What is the idea here that's being taught by this Midrash? So I want to just share the final explanation of the Midrash as to who the 70th person was that is not counted but is counted. And the Midrash says another thing similar to Dan. Serach bas Asher, hishlima imones haminyan. There are those who say it was Serach, the daughter of Asher, who completed the number, who was counted actually, as the Eitz Yosef says, she was counted twice. Even though she was mentioned earlier in the count of 66, she's also counted doubly, as he says, because she was very chashuv, she was very significant, she's considered like 2. Why? Because she was a righteous individual, she was very wise. And the Midrash goes on to quote that we have actually that Serach bas Asher is somebody who is referred to in Tanakh as the completer. She's the completer. We're looking for somebody who completes. She's the completer. How do we know that? Because the fact is that Serach bas Asher was still alive hundreds of years later, and she's mentioned in Tanakh. This is also in Shmuel Beis in 2 Samuel chapter 20 verses 16 and 17. It speaks about a wise woman. Vatikra isha chachama min ha'ir vayikra ve'eleh v'tamer ha'isha ahad to'yoev. There is this wise woman in the city who, as the Midrash says, is actually referring to Serach bas Asher. She was still alive. And she has this whole conversation. Yoav came because he wanted to get a certain person who had done certain things wrong, and he wanted to kill that person. But he came and he was making a siege on the entire city. So this wise woman, who is actually Serach bas Asher, comes out and she asks him some questions. The verse tells us that she says to him, Ha'ata Yoav. Are you Yoav? Are you this person who's coming to try to destroy the city when you're looking for one person? He says yes. And then she continues the conversation and says, you might be Yoav, but you're not doing the right thing. You're not doing what the Torah says. Do you not know what it says in the Torah? That when you come to a city, the first thing that you're supposed to do is call out for peace. So he hears these questions from this wise woman, and he says to her, he says, who are you? And she says, I am the one who completes the emunah, the faith of Israel. Says the Midrash, what does she mean? I'm the one who completed the number of the Jewish people in Egypt. I I was the one, when Moshe Rabbeinu Moses is about to leave Egypt and he doesn't know where Yosef was buried, he doesn't know where the bones of Joseph are, which the Jewish people had promised Joseph that they're going to take his bones away. She knew, she had been there when they came in, she knew where Yosef had been buried, she was able to tell this to Moshe. So she's the one who's the completer. She was the one who allowed the Jewish people to be able to leave Egypt. And so she was the one who's the completer here as well, according to this opinion in the Midrash. Now we need to understand again, what is the Midrash saying? What is the idea? Who is Serach bas Asher? What would it mean that she be counted twice because of the fact that she's so wise? What does it mean that she's the completer? What is the idea of this completer? What is the midah of Serach bas Asher? What is the concept behind her? How do all of these different explanations of the Midrash, what is the theme that runs through each of them, which we could say would explain how it could be that they're not even really truly in an argument, these different opinions, but there's a theme that runs through all of these ideas, all of these possibilities, which is the underlying concept behind the missing number 70 and the completion. When you only have one missing, there's a completion that gets you to 70. What is the underlying theme here? Now, if we look back at all of these different midrashim, if we look back at each of the different explanations, there is a hint to the concept, the underlying concept, which is in each of them. But we're going to start with Serach. We're going to work in reverse. We're going to start with Serach, and we'll see that her idea, her concept, is this aspect of hashlam, of completion, and the way that she completes things is in a very specific way. The Midrash tells us that earlier in the Parsha, that when it came to telling Yaakov Avinu, when it came to telling Jacob that Yosef was still alive, so they were afraid. The brothers were afraid to tell him. They were afraid that he would have a heart attack, that he would be so excited, he wouldn't be able to handle the news. What did they do? So this is a Midrash Hagadol. It's in chapter 45, verse 26. Amar l'Serach bas Asher. They said to Serach, the daughter of Asher, Imri l'Avinu Yaakov she Yosef Kaim v'hu Mitzrayim. Tell our father, you know how to do it. You tell our father, Yaakov Avinu, that Yosef is still alive and he's in Egypt. Me'asas. So what did she do? What was her approach? Himtina layachu ami b'tfila. She waited until he was praying. Ba'ama b'lashon tema. And she said it in a questioning way. She said, Yosef in Mitzrayim? Is Joseph in Egypt? Yivoldu al birkayim menash v'Ephraim? Did he have these? Is it true? Did you hear the news? She spoke as if she was talking to somebody else in a questioning way. Did you hear that Joseph is in Egypt? He's alive. He has 2 children, Menashe and Ephraim. Pugli boy. The response of Yaakov was that his heart closed. Shomi b'tfila. He was in the middle of praying. His first response was, it can't be true. Hishlim. Once he completed his prayer, what happened? Ra ha'golis. He saw the Agolis, he saw these wagons which had been sent. He was able to receive the news because of the way that Serach had said it. What was special about Serach? What was her ability? What was unique about her? Was that she was able to teach something with a question. She was able to give over information in such a way that it would be received, not by forcing the information down the person's throat, but rather asking it in a question. In this Midrash, in the Psukim, we read that when it came to Yoav, she still had that approach. She asked him, are you Yoav? Everybody knew who Yoav was. He was famous. He was the Sarat Tzava. He was the head of the army. Everybody knew who he was. He was famous. She said, are you Yoav? Is it true? Doesn't the Torah say that when you come to a city to lay siege to it, you're supposed to first call out in peace? And it's very interesting because he responds and says, who are you? And then she says, I'm the completer. I'm the completer. I'm able to complete things because I know how to ask. I know how to take an approach where the completion, the bringing to the next stage happens through a question, through something that's missing. By asking a question, when I ask a question, I'm saying there's something missing. And then the person on their own can figure out what's missing. When Serach said to Yaakov, is it true? Yaakov Avinu, is it true that he's still alive? And amazingly, he was standing in prayer, which is also this idea of lack of completion. If I'm praying to God, I'm asking God for something. I'm saying I'm missing something. There he was standing in a state of being ready to receive, in a state of missing something, and she gives over the information in a way of something's missing. She's the one who completes. She's the one who represents the aspect of you have 69 people, there's something missing, but there's a completion. which is a 70. Let's look back now at Dan. We look at Dan, Chushim ben Dan. His son is missing. He can't hear anything. It's only one child. He's missing. He doesn't have 10 children like Binyamin, like Benjamin. There's something seems to be missing. But that's the aspect of the 70th, which is missing something, and there's a completion that comes as a result of that. He's mizbarech, he's blessed. And even though the numbers look like they're in the 60s, the 62,000, 63,000, it doesn't matter. It's still considered 70,000. The number 70 is the completion. The number 7 is the completion. I noticed that if you look at the account of the 7 days of creation, so each day Hashem says, Yom Harishan, Yom Echad, the first day, Yom Hasheni, Yom Shlishi, Yom Revi, Yom Hashishi. It never says it was evening and it was morning, Yom Hashvi. It doesn't say that about the 7th. The 7th is mentioned. It's mentioned that Hashem blessed the 7th day, but it doesn't talk about the 7th in and of itself. The 7th is something which is a completion which isn't counted. It's not enumerated. And that's the 70, the 7, and that's the 70 as well. That's the 70,000. And that's this idea here. So we see it in Chushim ben Dan as well. He's not able to hear. He's missing something, but he is the completion. He's only one. But the very place where something is missing is where the completion is. The moon, it's something which keeps going into missing. Like Hashem says to the moon during the 7 days of creation, Hashem says, Mati etzatzmeich. You want to know how to be a king? You want to know how to reign? You have to make yourself limited. You have to diminish yourself. And that's the aspect of Dan. He's referred to as the place where he lives is the place of Chodesh, of the new moon, of the Yerach, of the moon. That's this aspect. And when we look at the mashal, amazing thing, we look at the mashal is beautiful. 999. You have a legion of 999 people. It's 1,000 people. No, there's only 999. Why? Because it's a recognition of the fact that who completes this? Who's the true leader? Who is this legion for? It's for the king. It's for the king. When I diminish myself, when I diminish who I believe I am, when I diminish myself, that's where the 70th aspect comes in. And that's HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What does it mean that the measure say HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the mashlim? God is the one who completes the 70th. When there's an aspect of diminishment, that's where Hashem comes in. That's where God is completing everything, and it becomes apparent. When I don't count that 70th, that's where it becomes apparent that Hashem is there, completing it, bringing in that completion, bringing in that completed aspect. And that's Yaakov. We're talking about his children. We're talking about the Yotzei Yerech Yaakov. But of course, Yaakov is manifest in all of his children. So when we speak about him and we don't count him, we are counting him. Yaakov is the completion of the 70 because really he is manifest. He brings together all of the kochos, all of the different powers, all of the different aspects that need to be manifest in the world through his children. He completes them. So he is the 70th aspect which is not counted, but is counted. And then finally we come back to the first one which is mentioned, which is Yocheved, which is an unbelievable idea. Yocheved is, look at her name. Her name is Yud Vav, which is a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to Hashem, Kavod. The one who gives honor to God. Who is Yocheved? She was the mother of Moshe, of Aaron, of Miriam, the leaders of the Jewish people who would bring them out, who would bring them to the next stage of completion, bringing them to become a nation, a complete nation. But everything that they have was not theirs. Consistently, Moshe Rabbeinu is talking about the fact that he's nothing. Aaron HaKohen, nothing. He's quiet. Vayidam Aaron, Miriam and Neviah, is the deepest level of one who completely praises Hashem. She sings to God with a toiful machal, and even the praise itself she drowns out, so to speak. Yocheved is the completion of the 70 because she is somebody who's not there, and she is there. She's a fetus. She's not completely there, and she is there. She's the one who completes it. And so we have this unbelievable idea, which is the depth of the completion of the concept where we are counting and we're not counting. And Hashem is teaching us, as the Jewish people come down to Egypt, that there's a number. We count because the Jewish people are going to begin to manifest God in the world. And the secret to that manifestation, the completion of that manifestation, is in the limitation, the recognition that I can't do it. I can't do it without Hashem. I am here only to manifest Hashem. And to the degree that I minimize myself, to the degree that I recognize that there's a question to ask, as Serach did, that I'm missing something, as Don had it, that I'm here to manifest Hashem, and that I'm nothing on my own, I'm really just a manifestation of Yaakov, of something greater than me, or that I'm Yocheved, I'm not here for myself, I'm here to bring honor to God, and even the fact that I'm here, I'm just in a fetus form, in a fetal form, to the degree that I recognize that, so then I will indeed manifest Hashem in the world, and I will be the Hashlama, as Serach was, as all of these individuals were. I will be the Hashlama, the completion of bringing a revelation of Hashem into the world. So I bless you, and please bless me back, that Hashem should help us to internalize this idea, help us to understand the depth of the idea, and that we should be able to manifest this idea in our lives, in all of our relationships, as we continue in our service of Hashem, in our growth in Avodas Hashem. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.